KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning. Blessed to be a part of your day. We've got our great friend Steve Yates joining us, former chairman of the Idaho Republican Party, man of the world. We're seeing him all the time on all the big shows, traveling a lot. And here I thought that after the campaign, you would just settle down. Maybe it was hang out in Idaho Falls, maybe hang out with us more in the Treasure Valley. You've been a busy person.
I have been around a little bit, and most of it's been very positive. It's been a nice change of pace for me to get out and about. I thoroughly enjoyed 4 years of traveling around Idaho and spending a lot of times with grassroots organizers. But after the primary went the way it did for me, I had the opportunity to get back to reviving elements of my consulting work, some of the media work that I'd done before. I didn't really make it a part of the campaign. Maybe that was a good or bad idea, I'm not sure. But prior to my volunteer service here in Idaho, I'd actually spent a lot of time on Fox News and Fox Business and some international networks, and I enjoyed doing the commentary there and have had some nice news stories to be big hooks, whether it's the president's meeting with Vladimir and some of the sanctions with the China trade war that have put me front and center with what the folks in New York want to talk about.
Well, let's just take a look at the state of the Republican Party. And I'm going to, I want to ask you about your race. If you'd like to comment, sure. But what did you make of the governor's race? I still love talking about that. Great political theater, a ton of resources spent. And now we have candidate Brad Little emerging. You were in the field. You were campaigning for your own campaign, but you have a unique insight that most of us never will have.
Well, it's unique, so maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. But also, I was very, very preoccupied with running in a different lane from the governor's race. So, of course, traveled around at a lot of the same events as the gubernatorial candidates. And each of the three men that were the main candidates, I know each of them in different ways and respect them in their different experiences in life. And it was interesting for me to be able to see them really compete heavily for the position. It was a very different cycle. A lot of people talked about how different it was to have three main contenders for an open seat for governor, and whether that's even happened before in Idaho. And I'm sure if people go back over the history books, there'll be something that is approximate. But this was different. There were major resources thrown into it. I saw some sharp elbows thrown, but those get thrown in politics all the time. I had a very, very good friend of mine that came into the White House during one of my years there, who was a professor at a major university, brought him into the Situation Room, thought there was a fairly spicy debate that had gone on during that session. I came out of it saying, hey, well, I'm not sure that was the best example of how things go, but what did you make of it? He said, oh, it was fantastic. I said, well, it was a little bit contentious. He says, no. The most brutal form of politics is the faculty meeting because the stakes are so low. And so sometimes when you get down to grassroots politics, the elbows are thrown even harder than they are in a presidential campaign. And there were a few in the gubernatorial race. But all in all, when you have three candidates or more candidates, as was the case in other races, you end up with divided votes. You have relatively low participation rates in primaries. And so if you're dividing the pie up, sometimes candidates that wouldn't otherwise have been seen to be a front runner can come through, or you have different theories of how votes divide. And as is usually the case, hindsight is 20/20. We can all be masters of, I knew it all along. This is the way it was going to be after the fact. But I don't know that Brad Little's campaign felt like they had it in a walk. I think that there were probably some surprised folks in the Labrador and Alquist campaigns that felt like they had some strong momentum going in. I have nothing negative to say about any of the three men that were the candidates themselves. I know from firsthand experience what it's like to put it all on the line and see where the dice come up. I'm sure that the Little campaign has done some work to try to draw support from the camps that came up short on primary day. It's definitely a different kind of general election cycle than it was in the primary. Lots of energy in the primary, and I think summertime in this general has been a little bit slow.
Indeed. Bringing the party together, I think it would have been a little bit more of a challenge if it had been Congressman Labrador or Dr. Alquist, but, Brad Little hasn't stopped working. Mm-hmm. What about his opponent? Your thoughts on Paulette Jordan? Again, the darling of the national media, the local media, not so much.
Yeah, I don't know Paulette personally. I did volunteer a fair amount of time to help a gentleman named Carl Berglund up in the Moscow area who ran against her in the election in 2016. Christian conservative fellow, who's a wonderful friend of mine. And so I only really know of Paulette from that contest. Carl was very clear about what his beliefs were, but was very polite, collegial, respectful as a candidate, which I admire a great deal. So I don't know Paulette a great deal personally. I have seen her walking around D.C., and I happened to be there at a time catching up with friends after the primary, and walking along the sidewalk outside a facility. One of my colleagues said, "Hey, I think that's Paulette Jordan," and so I've seen her making the rounds. She's made a few comments and attended a few meetings with national figures that I don't think are as popular in Idaho as they might be on Democrat national networks. So, the Al Gores of the world and other people that I don't think would be great vote catchers here. And I've heard people say that she can give a pretty good presentation, but I've never had the privilege of an in-depth conversation with her. So I think the numbers in Idaho are prohibitively in favor of the Republicans, but they can't take that for granted. We need people to turn out. We need people to work. We need people to be engaged. And we need candidates that are inviting people to get on board and be a part of somewhat of a movement. And that's what I tried to encourage as a chairman. I tried to lead by example as a candidate. Sometimes we do a better job than others.
Steve Yates joining us, Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Why, and for those of us here in the Treasure Valley, we think, it's just Idaho. Why would somebody from Idaho running for governor be in Washington? How does that work?
Well, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff on state politics. So there are organizations, associations that care very much about what's happening in state politics. And there are groups that have a very organized collaboration with state legislators. There are associations for almost any office you can imagine, from speakers to Senate leaders to governors, lieutenant governors, treasurers, just about everything. And so there are equities that states have in Washington under our Constitution. That's what our United States Senate was supposed to be for, of having each state send, like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2 people to Washington to represent the interests of the state. But there are governors associations, lieutenant governors associations, and then there are interest groups that have an equity in something that might be particularly high profile in your state. So, for instance, we have a Medicaid expansion initiative that's on the ballot. There's gaming that comes up as a topic. So it can be fundraising.
I don't mean to interrupt on that, but many people believe that the Jordan campaign will gain something by this Medicaid expansion. How do you see it?
I think it's plausible in that that's an issue that's going to be a well-funded ad, and the public will be engaged somewhat. They'll have people that may be volunteer or paid volunteers as they go, get people to be aware of Election Day. While it's shocking to many of us that are engaged listeners and participants, some people actually need to be reminded when Election Day is,
sure.
And that they can go out and vote early if they so choose. And so I think that there'll be a well-funded effort, and some of that Washington money probably is going to help fund Get Out the Vote for that initiative, and there could be a spillover effect for people who on net support that. And the theory goes that that's not a very conservative policy point of view. So if you're turning out people who are voting against what is a bedrock conservative policy point of view, it'll help candidates that are on that side of politics.
Indeed. Steve Yates joining us, Kevin Miller here, KIDO Talk Radio. I go back to this horse racing thing, and I'm wondering, Medicaid expansion, very big, but they haven't really hit the airwaves yet. But the horse racing people, they're all over the place, obviously well-funded. And then you have, whether it's the tribes or someone else, you expect the counter ads coming as well. So perhaps we're not going to see as many ads for people but more prominently issues.
Yeah, I do think that there will be some serious issue ads, and that's kind of the way outside money plays a role in Idaho, too. And it's a controversial subject, and I think people have a great deal of difficulty getting their hands around who's doing what with whom. In my experience, there is sort of blame all the way around. There are lots of conservative activists who use outside money for their purposes, and there are liberal activists who use outside money for their purposes, and there's nothing illegal about it. But getting transparency and compliance with our state sunshine laws is quite a big challenge. But I do expect that there'll be outside money. It probably will be focused on issues. What I hope is that we don't end up in some kind of well-funded negative campaign and people just get tuned out as Election Day comes. Because like I say, at least from my point of view as a partisan Republican, I want as many Republicans to turn out and cast their ballots. And I don't want them to be turned off by some kind of mudslinging campaign that gets beyond their ability to digest as the day comes.
Well, and that's really what it comes down to, these groups that are funding these efforts and such. Again, I wonder how this campaign will be different from what we saw in May.
Well, I look back to my experience in 2014. I think everyone's experience in 2014. That's, we had A.J. Belukoff was a reasonably well-liked candidate on the Democrat side, obviously well-off, and so therefore could have a well-funded campaign. There was a season in that general election. I had just barely been elected chairman of the Republican Party in Idaho at an emergency meeting in August. And so by the time we got around to Labor Day in 2014, there was a sense that horse race was narrowing. There was a pretty strong push to try to rally support, fundraising, advertising, getting independent groups active, trying to unify the party. We'd had a contentious primary. Really, there was a hangover from that primary where a gap hadn't really been bridged over the course of that summer. And so there was a lot of work to pull things together. I think fundamentally, the Little campaign is in a better position than the Otter campaign was in 2014, just in terms of the mechanics and pulling people together. They had the luxury of, I think, to pat myself on the back, but also really the volunteers of the party, of several years of the party building volunteers and doing things that were more businesslike. And so I think the party is in a better position. The candidates don't have quite the divides in the Republican Party. I don't know that the wounds or the divisions of the primary have healed as much, but I never felt like they were as deep in this cycle in 2018 as they were in 14.
More coming up with Steve Yates. Hope you're having a great day. Great to be with you. Blessed to be a part of your day. Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning. Our great friend Steve Yates joining us. Hey, by the way, you got a group or... whenever we have somebody on, we always, as our way of compensation, as lowly as compensation as it can be, we always say, hey, if you have Steve Yates Incorporated, what are you doing? I mean,
yeah, well,
you want the public to talk to you, or you just want to, have this as your filter?
Anyone is welcome to send thank you letters, words of encouragement, anything they would like, to my company website. It's DCIadvisory.com. It has various forms of contact info there. They can send an email to syates@DCIadvisory.com. Follow me on Twitter @YatesDCIA. I find that Twitter is not nearly as active in Idaho as it is in some other parts of the world. But in a lot of the work that I do on national and international commentary, that's where the announcements go and different bits of commentary. So obviously I welcome everything positive to keep every ray of sunshine going every day.
Let's talk a little bit about what you learned as a candidate.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to it, and I think that when you have these kinds of transformational experiences in your life, I spent 5 years in the White House, and I think I spent the better part of the next 10 years unpacking from what did I see, what did I hear, what did I learn, what did I do that I should have done differently, but what are the good nuggets that you can take forward in your life. And being a statewide candidate in Idaho is truly a unique experience. And I think some of the things you learn is You can never start too early. You can never work too hard. You can never travel too much. You can never raise too much money. You can never, ever get as much advertising out as you would like. But in the end, it's really an interesting challenge to try to get people's attention, and try to convey some sense of what you would like to do with their support and hopefully earn their support. It seems very simple when you're an analyst and commentator. Believe me, I spent a lot of my life doing that. And I was an advisor to presidential campaigns and some other campaigns, and it is sure easy to come up with just absolute perfection when it comes to not being the one in the hot seat, the person in the arena itself. And so it's humbling when you're the one, and you're the one that says something. You're like, holy cow, where's the edit button? Can we go back and do another take?
Right.
When you're the candidate, it's just too late. So it was humbling and interesting that way. There are important offices in Idaho that I think that people should pay attention to, and I have to say, in retrospect, the lieutenant governor's office isn't one of them. That when people wake up in the morning, they don't actually sort of ponder who is the current or next lieutenant governor of our great state. And you could say that about some other offices. And I think that we have good people running for important offices. And I would somewhat naively hope that there'll come a day when people say, hey, I care about the future of our state, and I care about the very short list of people who represent the state in different ways. And how about every 2 years or every 4 years, I dial in to vote for the people that are going to Washington or Boise to represent me. And we have some good diehard folks who do it on a regular basis, but we have a super majority of Idahoans that just don't dial in when it comes primary time. And I'd love to be a part of changing that. I tried as chairman to do some things to move it forward, but I think the biggest lesson I learned was just how independent and disengaged from government and politics most Idahoans are. That's, in a way, lovely, and why a lot of us want to live here. But when it comes time to choose leaders, you kind of want people to dial in a little bit more.
When we take a look at the White House, before we do that, back with our great friend Steve Yates joining us, who's worked at the White House, who's worked just about everywhere, and we'll draw on that experience. Recently, we've been covering politics here in Idaho. And I hate to bore you. I could go on and on about that. But the White House, how's the president doing? And for people that aren't familiar with your story, if you could briefly share with us your experience as a young man working in the Bush White House.
Right. Well, I was just 32 years old when I had the great fortune of sitting eyeball to eyeball in the West Wing with Vice President Dick Cheney, a man I'd only ever really known by way of television. And the most disconcerting personal experience in that was he wasn't wearing his glasses during the conversation. And when you get used to a public figure looking a certain way, and we had a wide-ranging, long conversation, but I was still distracted. Why aren't you wearing your glasses? So that's what happens when you're 32 years old and maybe a little freaked out to be in an historic location talking to an historic figure. But the end of the conversation concluded with, I'm sure you'll make a fine addition to our team. And I became his Deputy National Security Advisor for 5 years, the beginning of the Bush administration. Before, during, and after 9/11, obviously the experience of that day and the reaction to that day was one of those things that I've been unpacking ever since, just trying to take in the full measure of what was experienced, what was learned. To this day, I still haven't been able to go to Ground Zero in New York. Some of the things you see and hear just stick with you, and I haven't been able to process that completely. But that was my experience in the White House. It's a rare privilege. It's a smaller real estate than people recognize. But I think, all things considered, President Trump has been doing some pretty incredible things. And I think the greatest challenge that analysts, pundits, and a lot of consumers of the news have in trying to follow this president is separating signal from noise. And the president does a fancy job of contributing to some of the noise, I think on purpose, to try to get people drawn away from where he's actually driving something from time to time. But when you just take a step back and look at where the judicial appointment process is, where the economy is in terms of its performance, the tax reform package that went through, and maybe another one coming after the midterm election. And look at the moving the capital, the embassy of the United States to Israel's true capital. Many two-term presidents saying they were going to do it. He did it in the first half of a first term. And just changing attitudes of allies on their defense spending contribution to alliances, but also their trade relationships with us. The big problems he's tackled with North Korea and the trade with China that still dominate the cycles. I mean, this has been a very meaty, substantive first 2 years. And you just wouldn't know it from the perception of chaos in the West Wing that gets talked about all the time.
Well, what's it like being in the West Wing, and not the TV show, but the actual West Wing?
Yeah.
And you've got
TV show's much nicer, by the way, much bigger.
And everybody is just pouncing.
Yeah.
And this is an overdrive.
It's fatiguing. It's exhilarating, of course, when you sort of take a moment and realize I'm at a very historic place. Here I am in the Oval Office. Here's the President of the United States, and here's a major foreign leader or a major domestic political figure in talking shop. And you've got a front row seat to history and some tough negotiations or big breakthroughs. That is very heady stuff. But it can be very exhausting. It was in the Bush time, especially when the Iraq War became very, very unpopular. You could go about town, you'd still be treated somewhat with respect, but there was a degree at which people wanted to haze you. Unfortunately for the people who've been working in the Trump White House, they have the normal fatigue of fast pace. They've got the interesting challenge of an unconventional president who makes his own policy and may or may not follow conventional processes in doing so. That's hard. It's hard to staff someone like that. But then they have the added problem of when they step out of the White House, there's a lot of people who think it's very American to be absolute jerks to those who are trying to do their best to serve the country. And that's the best way I can put it. It's not very diplomatic, but I mean, what's with people who think that they need to just attack and haze people who just get up and try to serve their country, staff the president? There was an election. He won fair and square.
Let's get back to that in a minute. More with our great friend Steve Yates coming up. You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Doug. KIDO Talk Radio. Our great friend Steve Yates joining us. Kevin Miller in the morning, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. So, we were talking just earlier, right before the news, this whole new world we're living in where Sarah Sanders and others, they're attacked just by going to a restaurant.
Right. And I wish that was just it. I mean, that's the one that everyone got notice of by way of reporting. But what I've noticed is just going and talking with friends that are in the current White House is they feel fatigued and somewhat under siege. Just so they work hard, they do these extraordinary jobs with long hours, and then we go about town. Like I said, when I was working in the White House, you'd go out and you get treated like you're an important person. And
right.
Those of us that are normal humans, you don't mind being treated like an important person every once in a while.
The beautiful people.
Yeah, and when you leave office, then you learn, oh, it was the office, it wasn't you. You're not that special.
But let me build on that for a minute before we get to Sarah Sanders and others. Can you describe it when you say long hours?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? What was a typical day like?
Well, especially in national security, but I think even with political and media responsibilities, it doesn't ever really stop. You're on call all the time. And that means literally all the time, 24/7, 365. You can get awakened at 1 a.m. because the North Koreans tested something, or because the Chinese intercepted one of our pilots, or there was some exercise in the Middle East and there is an all hands on deck. Who does the president need to call when he wakes? Who does the vice president need to call? Et cetera, et cetera. You're just on call all the time. My typical day would start in the 6 o'clock hour, usually close to 6 o'clock, and I'd go in, get ready, have an intelligence briefing. I would actually have breakfast after my intelligence briefing, just to have some fuel and body going through the day. Always unhealthful. And then the NSC would have its various staff meetings, go over.
So you'd arrive at work at 6 a.m.
Before.
Okay.
So I'd be up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning to commute in, because people think of D.C. as a glorious place to live, but those of us that commuted from the hinterland you'd spend a good chunk of your day just commuting.
Well, because of the cost is so high. So let's say, an hour commute? What would it be?
Yeah,
like?
I easy had an hour commute. And that's when it's dark 30. If you'd
that's when
waited
you
to
had
normal
your-
time, it'd be 2 hours.
And that's what you lived in probably in a big mansion, I would imagine.
Yeah, I lived in a nice townhome.
Okay.
After years of apartment dwelling, we finally hit the big time and got a townhome. And for those in Idaho that don't live in townhomes, those are row houses, not super huge, but we had a decent life. We adopted our 2 children during the time living in that glorious great space. And there were a lot of families that was life. You lived in kind of smallish square footage. You maybe had 1 car garage and some extra guest parking, and one or both of the adults in the house were commuting somewhere to go to work. A lot of people commuted in from distance into D.C. So that was kind of the morning. You go through, you have meetings, you'd have lots of papers you had to write, arguments you needed to have with people by phone, by email, in person. Every once in a while, it gets spicy in person. A lot of good. And then, by 5, 6 o'clock at night, the bigwigs would be wrapping down what the business portions of their days would be, and you would be finishing up prep for the next day. So the staff secretary would be gathering entries for the book that would go with the president and the vice president the following day from 6 p.m. onward, getting things ready for the next day. And there might be an evening event where a principal is giving a speech. You might need to throw in comments or edits to a member of the cabinet speech. The National Security Council's leadership might be going out and giving remarks, and you'd want to edit some things that were on the talking points for that. You have to watch what's covered in the news so that you're prepping people for what they might want to do to accept a media interview where they were otherwise inclined to decline, but now that something's in play, they need to go out and reach an audience. So it was just nonstop. And I would typically leave about 8 o'clock at night, and sometimes it would go longer, but that was actually seen as good hours because we were on the VP staff. And the vice president has the luxury of not having to engage on every issue, just the ones he cares about.
Right.
The president's staff, a lot of them wouldn't leave until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, so they're back at 6 a.m.
Right, but you're traveling, so you're getting home about 9, 10, something like that.
I was getting up before my 2-year-old, 3-year-old daughter was waking up, and I was getting home after she was going to bed. And then I was home on the weekends because I was working for the VP and had that luxury, but on call. And I had to have a part of my home that was set aside, locked door, for the bat phone, as we called it. So you could go in and turn your key and have a secure conversation.
An actual phone.
Yeah. It was a secure line so that you could have information conveyed from the Situation Room, and if I needed to call the vice president or his national security advisor or someone in the NSC, I could do that on a secure line from my home.
How, as a person, did you ever detoxify on the weekends? Because we talk about being so revved up and so bundled up and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you did get the weekends off, or you were working?
But occasionally we get called in. But I think that's actually one of the problems. You don't actually detoxify. You don't fully unwind. And in 5 years of that kind of pace, I only really had 1 full vacation. And I spent that vacation putting my wife and my daughter in a car and driving across the country because I couldn't get called back in. And I drove the I-90 route up from east to west to go to Idaho Falls to visit my parents, because in a lot of that area in between, no cell signal. So sit room couldn't reach me, couldn't get called back in. I could really unplug for about 2 weeks.
Unplugged with that massive drive.
Yes. Yeah, I mean that's kind of what it's like. And so when you hit stop on that and you leave the White House, it takes a while to really unwind and catch up with what did I just experience. It's like going on a roller coaster every day for 5 years, and it's exhilarating, but you can't quite process what did I just go through.
Right.
And it was a mix of things. And so but that's kind of what the days were like, and I don't think you ever unwind, and that's why I don't think it's actually healthful to spend more than, say, 3 years doing this kind of. I did 5, so I dug an early grave with the other 2 years of staying after it. But it was physically not healthy. Mentally, you gotta kind of get some clean air out there and walk away from it.
Right. And the White House itself, from what we've heard, it's a very small working space.
It is. The West Wing and the White House residence it's a much smaller place than you'd expect. And this is one of the presidents where I'm sure it was a downgrade in terms of, the different bells and whistles that you have. I mean, staying in the presidential suite at a Trump International Hotel, I'm sure is larger real estate and maybe even some nicer accoutrements than you'd have in the White House mansion. It was a mansion for a couple centuries ago. If you're walking in the halls of the West Wing, I remember one of the first weeks I was there, I came around the corner, everyone's super important, so you're walking fast, and I walk right into the middle of the chest of General Hugh Shelton, who's an absolute mountain of a man.
Sure.
And I just, was nose to nose with all the medals on his chest because I didn't quite measure up to the rest of Hugh Shelton. It's really confined quarters. And you've been to the press room.
Right.
People see that podium. They can't have a sense of the lack of physical space that's really there.
And that's an expanded press room.
It is. It's expanded.
Right.
And it is literally built on top of a swimming pool that was not that big.
Right. It is amazing. And when you have been in, basically the residence is the third floor, is that right?
Yeah. So you go up. Yeah. So it's kind of the lower level is where the circle on the South Lawn, you'd have the president greet people and have welcoming ceremonies and stuff like that. You have the middle level that kind of the when the president is announcing a Supreme Court pick, that'll be done in the East Room. It's a nice, big, ornate room, but big in the context of the White House not being huge. Those are nice rooms, and the residence is upstairs from that. But the West Wing itself is tiny, and that show really did a disservice to it. But the Oval Office itself, when you step inside of it, you think, this is the CEO of the most powerful, awesome country on the whole planet. And this is a fairly confined workspace. The staff secretary will really only arrange for a maximum of 16 people to be in a meeting at a time in that space. You think of it, that's you walk into even mid-sized companies, their CEOs will have bigger offices, and every cabinet secretary has a bigger office than the president does. It's just kind of funny. I always thought when you walk in, it's tiny.
Sure, but Steve Yates joining us here, 107.5 FM. 580 AM, talking about, whatever he wants to talking about just what it's like to work in the White House. But I'm trying to think of, the first president that lived here, the White House burning down,
Yep.
and then, I was struck by just how old the flooring is.
Yep.
Or you just look at the walls and such. It's a living museum.
It is. And that's part of what makes it special. I do think those are some of the best experiences of my time there. And I know people that come and go to Washington, those who work there, it's still really an amazing honor to just be in that residence, think of the historic figures that have been there before, and if you're at a Christmas reception or something like that, and you're in one of those event rooms and looking out the window and you can see across the South Lawn to the Washington Monument, you just think, oh my gosh, here's this absolute unique view coming from this historic place. It is old style. There are a lot of old style buildings around D.C. That's one of the nicer parts of D.C. as a city compared to some other cities. There's some old real estate that's been preserved. But yeah, the White House itself, I mean, it was the people's house, the people's mansion. I mean, up until not that many presidents ago, people could just walk up and throw a blanket out and have a picnic on the lawn.
Right. You could try that now. It wouldn't end well for you. Yes.
Yeah.
It really wouldn't end well for you. We've got about 2 minutes left in this segment. We're going to have a turnover in the first congressional. Looks like we'll be calling Russ Fulcher, former senator, state senator, Congressman Fulcher.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on what he's going to do and what to expect from him?
Well, I think he's a good man, an interesting man. We're going to have a little bit of change in style, I would expect, from Congressman Labrador to Congressman Fulcher. But it's really up to him to decide the brand he wants to establish for himself. Our delegation in D.C. is at its best when it finds a way for each of the different personalities to do the best it can for Idaho. So I hope that the delegation does a good job of communicating together and multiplying the impact Idaho can have on national issues. But Russ has an interesting background in business and international affairs, and having had a little bit of that in my life, I'm kind of excited for someone with those chops to enter some of those conversations back there. But I haven't had a chance since the primary to talk to him one-on-one on what his priorities are. But I know that there's a lot of people here in the First CD and in the state that wish him well and want to be of help if we can.
Well, and, it's funny. He's getting inundated with all these people, and his race isn't even decided yet.
Yeah, I just don't think there's that many Idahoans who've heard who's running against him.
On that note, we shall have more with Steve Yates coming up. Remember, KIDOTalkRadio.com. Coming up this week, Wednesday and Thursday, we'll be in Washington, D.C., holding their feet to the fire, as we do every year. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say to all of those opinion makers. You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio. KIDO Talk Radio, Steve Yates with us, Kevin Miller in the morning on 107.5 FM, 580 AM. We were talking about our congressional delegation. Are we almost at the peak of their influence, considering our senators have been around a while? Congressman Simpson, if it could break a certain way, and I don't think he expects this to happen, he could be chairman of the most powerful committee in Congress, Appropriations. You've got Jim Risch doing well, Mike Crapo doing well, Russ Fulcher coming in. Seniority, I would imagine, would be helping us the next congressional session, the new Congress.
Yeah. Well, certainly our senators are in some important spots in their body. That with Mike Crapo has significant seniority and has influence with leadership, and there's a lot of behind the scenes things that he does that I don't know that voters in Idaho can fully comprehend, but he's a very respected person there. Senator Jim Risch is in line to be the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Now, these musical chairs exercises are tough to predict with 100% accuracy, but he is next in line. He seems to have really taken an interest in foreign affairs and intelligence work on the Hill. And so that would be an opportunity for Idaho to be potentially in the spotlight in talking about executing the president's foreign policy agenda on the Hill in ways and bringing unique input. I've known some senators that are of national prominence that have been in that position. Of course, we have a former senator from the other party in Idaho, Frank Church, that had a legacy through that kind of a committee. But my growing up period, Jesse Helms was just a formative example of how to really use the power of committees and the Congress to drive a national agenda, at times defend conservative policy positions, held administrations, Democrat and Republican, feet to the fire on things when necessary, but also put pressure on international organizations like the UN by way of the platform that committee gives. So Senator Risch from our humble great state will have an opportunity perhaps to step into that kind of a chair, and that's a really important and interesting opportunity. And Congressman Simpson for sure has some seniority and influence over some committees that are that really have an impact on the sausage making process that a lot of people don't really like to get into. It's much more complicated than meets the eye, even for those of us that are allegedly educated. So getting into it, it's important to have someone who knows the substance and process really, really well, and then has not just a vote, but a leadership role in shaping where that goes. That can make a big, big difference for equities in our state and our country. So what we assume will be Congressman Fulcher. It's still to be determined what committee assignments he'll have and what relationships he'll forge. And so we'll leave that as the tapestry that's yet to be painted in. But really, we do have some high power positions to advance our interests in D.C. And I sure hope that all of them are engaging the Kevin Miller Show to come back and return and report to our voters about all the great things that they can do from these august positions.
Steve Yates with us. Appreciate that, Larry. Let's continue on with Steve Yates. We've got about 2 minutes left in this segment. So we've gone over our congressional folks, the president. You take a look at the various forces aligning against the president. Mueller, the press. Obviously, your years of the White House, is that a big distraction if you've got a special counsel looming?
It is a big distraction, and it's problematic on a number of fronts. I mean, I'm one of those that believes that there was never a legal basis to begin this process. I'm also one of those who believes that the special prosecutor authority is something that is outside what the framers of the Constitution ever envisioned. And so I understand that these things have happened, and it seems heretical to be suggesting that they're unconstitutional in some people's minds, but I actually think it is. It is the only force out there that can steal your assets, destroy your life, and there's no real oversight of that process. Now, that's deeply troubling to me. And if you're a staffer in the White House or you worked on a campaign and there's someone combing over every email, every rumor, every innuendo, and able to pull you in and interrogate you and potentially destroy your life, that is distracting. And so that's a problem. But all things considered, President Trump is a force of nature, and he has plowed through this better than anyone could have imagined, in my estimation. I don't think that there ever was any collusion for there to be found, but as I witnessed firsthand, with Patrick Fitzgerald being unleashed on the Bush administration, my friend Scooter Libby ended up being convicted of something that had nothing whatsoever to do with the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity. And so there's I think, a litany of examples of these things starting out with a mission. They spend unlimited resources, and then they kind of wind up with a victim that had nothing whatsoever to do with the original alleged crime. And that's distracting, it's disappointing. I just hope that this team pushes through, that we have a strong midterm election, and that we get into that reelect where I dare Democrats to try to say that they don't want the economy to grow this way. You don't want judges that are doing the things that the Trump judges are doing. I think that's a good, strong place.
All right, Steve Yates, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio.